Is the Linda Eastburn YouTube channel, and I want to invite all of the audience to please subscribe to the channel. That really helps us out. It doesn't cost you anything, it's totally free. And just click on that subscribe button, and it will keep our channel going. So, as most of you know, the audience out there knows we do Bigfoot on this show, but today we're going to get into some things Bigfoot related as well as other things. My guest is Joshua Cutchin. Thank you, Joshua, for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Linda. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm glad you are here. So I understand you've written several books and you have done some Bigfoot research. So tell me what you know about Bigfoot.
Well, I don't think I know anything about Bigfoot. I don't think that really many people do. I think that people know about the history of sightings and they know about sort of some of the world mythologies about wild men. But as far as like exactly what we're dealing with when we go out into the woods, I don't think a lot of people do know about that. So, a little bit of background about me. Depending on how you count it, I've written about 10 books in this space. Bigfoot has always been my first love, to be quite honest with you. Um, as it turned out, I guess maybe it's hereditary because my dad was subscribing to like apparently there was a paper like snail mail BFRO newsletter back in the day. So my dad was apparently subscribed to that. So it's been in my DNA for a while. But I ended up writing my first book in 2015. A Trojan Feast was the name of that one. But I was about to take a break actually. Because Bigfoot's been in all of my books over the years, but I hadn't really done anything Bigfoot specific slash dedicated to Bigfoot. And I was going to take a break just prior to when my twin boys were born back in 2018, 2019. And my friend Timothy Renner said, "Hey, let's do the definitive guide to weird Bigfoot." And so that project became Where the Footprints End, Volume One and Volume Two. And it's to give people an idea of sort of where I'm coming from with the Bigfoot question. For years, I was very much an adherent to the idea that we're dealing with a relic hominid. I think that of all these topics, UFOs, ghosts, maybe not psi, but UFOs and ghosts and other sort of things that go bump in the night, I think Bigfoot has the gold standard of evidence. I mean, I can sit here and talk to you all day about, mid-tarsal breaks and dermal ridges and and all these really compelling details that seem anatomically consistent with a large primate in places like North America. The first book that I will press into people's hands is Jeff Meldrum's Legend Meets Science. I think that there's so much good evidence that points towards this being a large undiscovered hominid. At the same time, uh, over the years, I became very aware of some of these outlier stories, things that involve, anomalous lights in the forest seen around places with Bigfoot, or people having synchronicities with Bigfoot, or a lot of these habituators will just so happen to have ghosts on their property as well, or people seeing Bigfoot disappearing and blinking in and out of existence. Enough outliers that it made me sort of question that conventional cryptozoological narrative. And when you put that with the fact that I think if you stick with this long enough, a certain amount of skepticism does creep in terms of like, well, we should have a body. And yes, I can have conversations with anyone about, the number of bears that we find and the number of mountain lion bodies that we find and how porcupines will take bones sometimes up a tree and gnaw on them until they don't exist. Like I'm aware of all that, but like we have found bear carcasses, we have found cougar carcasses. We have not publicly, I guess, found a Bigfoot carcass. I feel like we should have better evidence for this thing if it is indeed a flesh and blood creature. So that's the one end of my personality. And the other end of my personality is talking to people whom I trust, talking to people whom are avid outdoorsmen and outdoorswomen, who can identify these things, who can identify animals really well, and have spent basically half their lives, out in the wilderness, and they'll tell me that, like, look, I saw this thing and it looked like a giant hairy person. So how do you square those two things? How do you square the lack of smoking gun type evidence? Because remember, I think there's a lot of great Bigfoot evidence, but how do you square that lack of smoking gun type evidence with these stories of people who are very confident about what they've seen? And so that's what led me into the territory that I sort of went into with my friend Tim Renner, which was the idea of Bigfoot as being just something stranger. Um, Again, as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, I'm not sure I can even say I know what it is. I don't. I have suspicions, and I have, I see things that make me question what it could be. But I do think that there's something about Bigfoot which we will call paranormal, or we will call, at the very least, vanguard science. We're pushing the boundaries of what we think about when we think about a flesh and blood creature. So that's sort of been my stance. Uh, I'm not militant. I'm not militant about it. I just, ask people to hear some of the things that I'm saying and acknowledge the fact that we shouldn't be suppressing eyewitnesses just because they have odd outliers in their stories, and to just sort of work together. Both the flesh and blood people and the people who suspect paranormal Bigfoot work together and head in a direction towards maybe getting some traction on not answers, but a better understanding of what's out there in the woods.
Well, I totally agree with you. I think there does need to be, and there does seem to be a divide in the community. There's the flesh and blood believers that, it's a creature in the woods. We're just not identifying as to exactly what it is yet, but it reproduces. And like you said, there's so much evidence that this is something flesh and blood out there. There's offspring, there's poop, there's the visual sightings of them. They seem to have everything that seems to be somewhat normal as to being a being or a creature in the woods. And then there's the other body of people who have very unusual and paranormal experiences with them. They disappear. They make sounds and all kinds of things that then they can't see where that's coming from, or what should be a completely disarray campsite. They're hearing it broken up, but then the next day there's nothing changed, nothing
Yeah,
has
that's a
moved.
that's a great Ron Moorhead example. I remember him talking about that too. Yeah, and just
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and so like yeah, and so it's I think really what I'm trying to advocate for is like a position of agnosticism and openness and honesty in this regard. Because like I think part of where we have this tension is that we see things like poop and especially footprints, right? The footprints, God, I love the footprints so much. Like they're so good. Um, and we look at that and we say, well, let's say Bigfoot is something more like a ghost. Well, ghosts don't leave footprints. But actually, if you go back and you look at like, 19th century parapsychology journals or something, that was one of the first ways that we used to ghost hunt, is we used to put talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to manifest. Ghosts, whatever ghosts are, if they exist, seem capable of knocking things off shelves and slamming doors and leaving footprints. So what happens when you take that sort of suite of activity out of a household and you put it in the forest? I would argue it looks a lot like Class B Bigfoot reports. If you go through the BFRO, listing, Class A is you actually saw Bigfoot, something that's sort of undeniable. But the Class B stuff is like stones being thrown, unusual voices, mimicry, foul smells, footprints, wood knocks. And honestly, if you this is the same sort of things that you read about when you read about a poltergeist infestation in a house. It's just that it happens to be outdoors. And so, unless you see Bigfoot, you can't really be entirely sure that Bigfoot's to blame for it, right? So, it's kind of made me wonder if there's not at least some subset of Bigfoot reports that could be better understood through the lens of poltergeist activity, which is it's a whole different can of worms, I suppose.
And the poltergeist activity, hasn't that been somewhat related to some, emotional projections and things of people even?
That's very astute. Yeah, it's interesting. I would argue that the two sort of phenomena that seem to characterize all aspects of the paranormal are anomalous lights and poltergeist phenomena. You see poltergeist phenomena in people's lives after near-death experiences. You see it after UFO experiences. Dr. Jacques Vallée said that it was the rule rather than the exception that people would have poltergeist experiences, or RSPK, residual spontaneous psychokinesis, in the aftermath of their UFO encounters. And to that extent, yeah, I mean, it's poltergeist phenomena might be related to spirits or ghosts or something, but there is an aspect of it that does seem to be generated by an agent, by a person at the center of all this activity. For the longest time, it was assumed to be a prepubescent individual. Oftentimes, it would be blamed on young women that were generating all this sort of RSPK around them. Recent years, it's become very apparent. There's a paper by an individual named Larson. It's apparent that this is just anybody who experiences a significant amount of stress can manifest this RSPK around them. So it's not just that sort of sexist, ageist version of interpretation of the events. But yeah, the poltergeist stuff is related to a lot of different things. And if you think about it being sort of maybe generated by an agent, it might kind of explain why some people go into the woods every weekend and seem to have some sort of Bigfoot or Bigfoot adjacent experience, and other people go out in the woods and they don't have anything happen to them. There's been this shift in, I don't know, over the past 50, 40 years or so, of a lot of these phenomena to say, oh, these seem to be centered as often around a person as just being a phenomenon that can happen to anyone.
Yeah, there's a group of people I know that meditate before going out or during a sky watch for UFOs. And when they meditate, oftentimes a craft will show up, and when they don't, they don't show up. But also going back to the PK idea, doing that, some people can do that more at will than just that spontaneous kind of projection. I don't know if you've ever read about someone called the PK man, but he was a guy that supposedly could generate lightning in the sky at will. He'd point
Hmm.
his finger and lightning would strike. He even had several people, very prominent individuals, that had signed affidavits that they saw him do this more than once. So whether someone can do that at will or not, I don't know. But we've all heard of the psychic phenomena of just being able to move something across a table or something like that. So there's all kinds of things. But when we're talking about visual and sound, and you put that into the paranormal range, I mean that's a huge part of paranormal research, is being able to visually see something, even if
Hmm.
it's just a foggy, smoky, thing. But Bigfoot seems to have a little bit more identity or parameter, that it really looks like a genuine creature in the woods.
Oh, I completely agree in that regard. I guess I would say that sort of my own way that I've sort of come to conceptualize. Well, I have another way of interpreting this, but let's leave that to the side for the moment. My way of sort of presenting this would be to say that if you talk to someone who's seen a full-bodied apparition, which I think that I have, I can never again that sort of help the agnosticism. I can never be entirely sure, but I think I've seen a full-bodied apparition. That was a young Civil War boy's ghost, Civil War soldier's ghost boy. It looked like a boy of that age wearing Civil War soldier clothing, but I don't think it was. You know what I mean? Similar in the way that, like, if you see a ghost train or a phantom train, of which, there are plenty of phantom wagons and phantom carriages and phantom trains and such. Um, it looks like a train and it sounds like a train. But we would all agree that it's not a train in the sense that you could actually go get on the ghost train. Like, it just sort of is maybe it's a psychic imprint, or it's a time slip, whatever it is. It doesn't seem to have that same sort of quality. So I would think, in my mind, there is something out there that often chooses this form, or often has this form chosen up for it, of something that perhaps used to exist, like, Australopithecus or Gigantopithecus or something, or something that is, sort of something that we've had across all cultures, which is this archetype of the wild man. That's one possibility. The other possibility, quite frankly, is that we're misdiagnosing what's going on, right? And what I mean by that is, if you look at something like the UFO question, it's probably not a one size fits all answer, right? You've got lights in the sky that might be might be extraterrestrials, they might be group poltergeist events, quite frankly. They might be spirit phenomena, they might be unexplained or unrecognized meteorological phenomena, they might be unorthodox aircraft, secret military testing. It's probably a lot of different things that answers that question, right? But we so rarely apply that same sort of thinking to something like the Bigfoot question. And if we do, and we can say, well, maybe this is a lot of different things going on, then maybe those Class B reports are poltergeist, wood forest poltergeist phenomena, right? And maybe we do have giant flesh and blood um, hominids that are out there in certain small populations throughout the wild places of America and the world over. And then maybe we also might have something where there's another phenomenon that's adopting that imagery. What I mean by this is my good friend Mike Cleland has done a lot of work on the intersection between UFOs and owls. Owls that are too large appearing in UFO experiencers' lives, or owls that seem to appear just before or after a UFO sighting, or owls that have telepathic communication with the witness. Weird owl stories and revolving around UFOs. Mike will not sit there and tell you that there are no such things as real flesh and blood owls, right? Like obviously there are. I could go to the zoo or even in my backyard on some days and see a real flesh and blood owl. But there's something else. Whatever's behind the UFO phenomenon, whatever behind spirit phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, there's something else that is here with us that sometimes appropriates the imagery of the owl to appear in a certain way. And you see this all across the UFO, phenomenon. You see deer sometimes that have involved that. You see people. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that there's something that likes to wear that as a mask. So maybe we do have forest poltergeist phenomena and conventional cryptozoological flesh and blood Bigfoot out there, and something else that chooses the image of Bigfoot just like it chooses the image of owls to wear as a mask sometimes when it interacts with us. I think it's important to keep all these different options open because I don't really think that there is a singular one size fits all answer for all these things.
I agree. Yeah, I 100% agree. And multitudes of things you said. I mean, we could just, I've been a UFO researcher long before I was a Bigfoot
Oh,
researcher.
awesome, awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I
Yeah.
do, exactly. And I remember one story of a woman that was just sitting in her living room, didn't have a particular belief in UFOs or aliens or anything like that. She's sitting there and she looks across from her, and there is a full-blown gray alien, looks just like a person sitting there in her living room, staring at her for about, a few minutes anyway, and then blinks out. I mean, how do you explain that? She's seen something the same as she would see a flesh and blood person sitting across from her. So when we're talking about Bigfoot in a paranormal sense, when we're looking at a Bigfoot, in the woods or elsewhere, are we really seeing a Bigfoot? And does it disappear because it's not really real? Because I don't think any of us believe that an alien is actually sitting in her living room, but in her mind, an alien is sitting in her living room.
Right. And I think that's part of what I was sort of getting at earlier with the idea of like, well, if Bigfoot is a ghost, it could still interact with and leave impressions in the earth and whatnot. I mean, that's similar to what I see with the UFO question, right? If anybody tells you that they're all psychic, well, the things leave dadgum burn marks in the ground. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to be completely psychic. But, at the same time, I remain highly skeptical of some of these nuts and bolts claims because like there are synchronicities and again poltergeist phenomena, all this weird metaphysical stuff like lingers around the UFO question. And I think part of what we're dealing with, and this is sort of my heresy among heresies, is that I think that we just don't understand the difference between internal and external, between physical and spirit, between fact and fiction. Quite honestly, I don't think that line is as solid and impenetrable, separating those two things as we would like to think between physical and psychic. So, one idea that I've been playing with lately with regards to the UFO question, and maybe who knows, it's applicable to the Bigfoot question as well, is that when I get up in the morning, like I am physical, like I am not like, I'm not astral traveling. Like I want to get up, get some breakfast and some coffee in me. Like I have physical needs. I would say that me, as someone who is pretty much not psychic at all, I'm like 80-20 physical psychic, right? But there's an important part of all of us, I think, that is in that psychic space, right? And I kind of wonder if a lot of these phenomena, again, UFOs in particular, maybe the Bigfoot as well, but like I wonder if a lot of these phenomena aren't the inverse, right? If they're not 80% psychic and 20% physical. And just as like we can traipse or accidentally stumble or deliberately go into that other psychic space and retrieve information and interact in that space, if there's not a similar sort of phase transition that happens on the other side of this, whatever this thing is, where they can sort of trip into our space and do these things as well. It sounds a lot like interdimensional theory, which I'm not unsympathetic to. I prefer to, frame these things in a lot more vague ways because I don't know really what another dimension is, right? But I think that these are useful concepts to play with. So with, the person that you talk to seeing that gray alien, like I don't, if it was in her mind's eye, which some people might call an hallucination, but I wouldn't call it that. But if it was in her mind's eye, it doesn't make it any less real to me because I don't think, again, we have a really good grasp on what's real and what's not real. And I
I think
think that
that's,
altered,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
why,
the thing.
yeah,
Perception is so individualized and it's so much dependent on our five senses, and our five senses can easily be tricked or fooled. I also do hypnosis, and I did hypnosis even before I was doing any of the research, and we were talking way back in the 80s. doing hypnosis, you can so fool the mind to believe that it's being burned by something, and actually a little burn or blister will show up on
Right.
the hand. So it believes things sometimes that may or may not be real. The reality that we have is a conceptual reality in our own minds, and we're so dependent upon our five senses to give us that reality.
Or real in this space. I mean, I think that altered states of consciousness in general play an incredibly important role in a lot of these interactions. And so I have been very interested in, you know, quite frankly, psychedelic trips, because a lot of these things, DMT is very much a topic of discussion now, but like ayahuasca and psilocybin mushrooms, all these things have aspects to them that quite resemble, especially the UFO contact. I can make a case. Tim and I made a case for some Bigfoot encounters as well, having sort of these aspects of these altered states of consciousness. Being involved. And I really think that it's interesting to sort of sit with that and look at things like, as a hypnotist, you've probably encountered this yourself, um, regardless of whether or not it's useful as a memory retrieval tool. A lot of times it seems when you put someone into a space on the couch to remember something, it's almost like they're slipping into a parallel timeline or something, because you can have them do things that they didn't do, but now they can do it in that space wherever they are. Um, for example, there's some accounts of people who encourage the patient who's being hypnotized to ask questions of the aliens that took them. And they'll ask questions that they didn't ask back when the abduction supposedly happened, but they can ask now that they're in this altered state of consciousness on the couch. So I think we are seeing the barest tip of the iceberg when it comes to what reality in general is, and it might actually be, more of a fractal or a prism than it is this one soul-based reality that we engage with every day.
And another thought around that is the holographic projections that are possible. And could there be a third party playing out some kind of a projection in our world now? Whether they would go to the trouble to project a Bigfoot in a real remote area where someone's deer hunting, doubtful. But still, one has to consider that.
Well, and we don't know how much trouble it is for, for these agents, whoever they are, if they're other people, or if, there's some sort of Gaian consciousness that projects these things, or any number of possibilities. I mean, again, I just really relish in sort of infinite possibilities and theorizing, and I think that that's another great point that you raise.
I think it's a lot easier for us to just believe that this is a flesh and blood being, and we deal with it the same way we would deal with any being that we would come across.
Well, it's it's
Um,
co- it's comforting, Linda. I mean, that's what it is, and that's the thing that I always try to emphasize to people whenever they sort of like get squeamish about my Bigfoot views. Is it's like, look, I want Bigfoot to be a flesh and blood creature. Like my inner 12-year-old really still wants big, because someday I'll be able to go to my old roommates and be like, "Ha ha, I was right," But I have to sort of entertain the idea that I might not. I have to make peace with with the possibility that I might not ever get that told you so moment.
exactly. And this is just a mild example, but when we made the movie Byways of Bigfoot along the Niagara River, I was not anticipating seeing any evidence out there. There was a piece of land that I'd interviewed a guy that had some unusual activity. He had not seen a Bigfoot. He had heard a little bit, a few things happening out there, but nothing definitive of a Bigfoot. But I thought, with all the reports along that river, we might as well go out and see what we can find.
Can't hurt.
And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and so when we arrived, there were tree branches, twisted and turned over, no evidence of a storm doing that, footprints underneath. We researched in three separate locations. In each location, there was some evidence presented. And I'm thinking, well, this is really very interesting that there would suddenly be all of this evidence everywhere we went. And we didn't go out and film that much. So it's like almost like the universe was saying, here, go here, look at this, do this, you're going to find this here. But
Oh,
that also reminded me of a very odd thing that happened when I was filming Intuitive Journeys, which was a remote viewing show. And we got off on the deep end with this. I'd asked the group to see where they could find portals. one person found an area that he thought there was a portal out there. And so we're getting ready to go out and film. And of course, me and my skepticism, I'm thinking, we will find nothing. I've been to that location a gajillion times and there's nothing to be
Well,
found there.
a lot of times those of us who believe the strongest are also the most skeptical because we want that sort of like unequivocal, okay, this was exactly what I thought it was kind of moment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So we're headed out there, and I'm thinking, okay, we've got to make this show at least interesting, but authentic. We didn't make up stuff on that show whatsoever. So I asked the crew and the group that we were before we headed out to this supposed portal area, if anything unusual happened to them, during the last 24 hours, because sometimes when you start thinking about things like this, things will start popping up, that precursor thing before going
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
And my cameraman said, well, I have something. There was this really weird circle in my yard today. And I'm going, you had a freaking crop circle form in your yard last
Or a
night?
fairy ring, or a fairy
Well,
ring. Yeah.
well, we did go. Luckily, we had a horticulture person with us in the group, and we went out there after. And sure enough, this crop circle had like the nodes were blown out like microwaves, not bent over,
Yep. Yep.
like would have happened in a little whirlwind storm or something like that. The soil, we did test it. We couldn't find the crystals in the soil, but possibly it was there. We just couldn't see it. We looked under a microscope and didn't find anything.
No, but
Then we,
good
yeah,
on y'all for having the foresight to like look at this through those like parameters because a lot of people would just be like, "Oh, look, crop circle, cool," and they'd move on. But like to like look at the nodes and to try to do this legwork. Yeah, good on
yeah,
y'all.
yeah. We did our homework, but the big tell sign was his dog that always went there to go to the bathroom would go around the circle for months. So it's like,
Really,
okay,
really.
something's going on here. But the
Yeah.
odd thing was, it's kind of like that. The same thing, that happens when we went out and made the Bigfoot film and saw the Bigfoot evidence. It's like, okay, I wanted something unusual to happen because we wanted the film to be good, and suddenly there's a crop circle forms, like as if consciousness is
Yeah.
interacting with us and behaving accordingly beforehand, even.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. I mean, you hear there is the sense when you're engaged with this stuff that there is a tricksterish, omniscient sort of force that's sort of orchestrating and allowing things to happen or not to happen. I'm coming off of, Linda, about a 10-ish, this isn't entirely true, but this is mostly true, a 10-ish year sort of dry spell with experiencing things. It's like as soon as I started to write about this stuff, my experiences really dried up. And it was just this past month, that I finally, I've had some Bigfoot adjacent stuff, through my life. Like I've heard some oddly bipedal shuffling through the forest, and after my honeymoon, after shouting some Bigfoot calls the night before, something had wedged a rock the size of a basketball behind one of the tires of my car. Like I don't in North Georgia in the middle of the mountains, so it's just weird. Like anyway, that's neither here nor there. But it's been mostly sort of a dry spell for the past 10 years or so. And last month, I feel like I feel like I've heard what people identify as Bigfoot. Notice what I did there, right? I've heard what people identify as Bigfoot probably about 9 different times, over the course of 2 weeks, being in various parts of North Georgia. Once with my family, I was awake in the middle of the night, and I was definitely awake because I made a note of it in my phone, so I was at least that awake. But then also when I was out with my friends Scott and Sheila Granger, and I also that a lot of sounds were going off that night, and also had something thrown at me, which we can talk about or just sort of move on from that. But the point I would like to make is that um, I have had sort of a little bit of a renaissance of experiences. Um, by doing things that I never would have done. So for the past 10 years, Linda, this is so, I guess I'm just dumb for thinking this, but it was my sort of my stance is I would never go on a ghost hunt or a Bigfoot outing or whatever wearing like a ghost t-shirt or a Bigfoot t-shirt or a cryptid t-shirt because I'm like that's too on the nose, right? Like you're not going to see Bigfoot if you're wearing a Bigfoot shirt. But this was actually the first of this month, November 1st. I had, some of the most interesting things to happen to me in a decade, and I was not wearing a Bigfoot shirt. I was bundled up because it was cold, and I was wearing at least two Bigfoot shirts and a Bigfoot hat, which was, really one of those like not only not only does it imply that there's some, for me, it implies that there's some sort of orchestrating force, but it's also an orchestrating force that loves to see me proven wrong, or loves to sort of upset my own expectations. And I think that's sort of a little, very much akin to sort of what you've experienced too, in the sense that like, oh, is there something, is there a bigger game at play here, you know?
And I think that just really requires getting out of the box and seeing a narrow view of how we perceive our day-to-day life. You get up
Right.
in the morning, you fix breakfast, you get in your car, you drive to work. You're seeing a physical reality because that helps you to maneuver through a physical reality. But if you look beyond that, out of that box, there may be something that's just askew of those physical impressions that may always be around and we just aren't perceiving it.
It's interesting that you use that specific phraseology because it's sort of been my philosophy for a long time, and I really haven't embraced it or put it into practice as much. Is that sort of like thinking outside of the box and anti-structural, switching things up? Because that's what I've always seen these phenomena as doing. Is like as soon as you feel like you're narrowing in on an answer or something definitive, then it just sort of like flies away like applying too much pressure to a watermelon seed, right? It just flies across the room. Um, and so who knows? Like maybe now I'll start wearing my cryptid gear when I go out, and then after a time it won't happen, and then I'll switch it up again, and then I'll revert back to my old rules of never wearing a Bigfoot shirt while looking for Bigfoot, and something will happen. I think that there's something about this that really something about this phenomenon, these phenomena that really appreciate switching things up and being anti-structural and just changing things. That's what the trickster's all about, at least.
I think you really do have to look at it differently. Changing the subject ever so slightly, and going back to Bigfoot, let's talk a little bit about remote viewing Bigfoot. I know there
Mm.
was one of the remote viewers who worked for on the Stargate project, and he discussed one time, and these are things you can't prove, so it's always iffy. But he was asked in a remote viewing session to remote view this one planet. Um, and as he did so, he saw a population there and they looked like Bigfoot on this other planet. And he thought that was, interesting. Of course, they can't prove anything because we're not on that planet. We don't know what lives on that planet, if anything. And we certainly don't know if what the creatures he saw on that planet have anything to do with Bigfoot on Earth. But what are your thoughts on remote viewing Bigfoot and any information that might even come in from that realm?
Well, I think, as far as like, the unfalsifiability of these things, I really am a big advocate for just taking in all sorts of information, information that you like and agree with, but also a lot of information that you disagree with or you don't know what to make of. And like, having a small basket in your head that says true and a small basket that says false. And in the middle of those is this gigantic planet-sized basket that says interesting if true, right? And to sort of keep that and file it away for later. And the idea, I think you can remote view just about anything. I think that there is a lot of, I think that remote viewing doesn't need to be 100% accurate 100% of the time to have some utility, right? If you look at, anything, musicianship or athleticism, sports and stuff like that, like no one's 100% perfect all the time, right? I think the remote viewing is probably something like that. And so like I have a great deal of respect for that discipline, and I think that there's been a lot of interesting things that have come out through different remote viewing programs and figures over the years. um as far as that specific anecdote, it's interesting if true, and that's where I would place it. As you probably might have guessed, I'm also not a big fan of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Maybe I'm just a contrarian. But I do view a lot of these phenomena as being interrelated in some way or another. So the idea of like, oh, there's a planet full of Bigfoot doesn't surprise me. Where I would probably part ways with that interpretation would be that I don't think that there are nuts and bolts spacecraft from Zebel Ganubi dropping off Bigfoot here and there. I do have to acknowledge, and I will readily acknowledge and happily acknowledge the fact that there's an overlap between UFOs and Bigfoot. Stan Gordon's work about the 1973, I believe it was, flap in Pennsylvania of UFOs and Bigfoot. Like, there's a connection here. There's anomalous lights at a lot of these sites of heavy Bigfoot activity. There's a connection there, and I love that connection. And I relish in that connection. I just don't adhere to the conventional interpretation that we're dealing with little green men from, another planet. I think that this is all one big ball of wax. And so, what do we make of something that looks very much like another planet populated by Bigfoot? I tend to look at a lot of this stuff as we were talking about, altered states of consciousness and whatnot. I feel like a lot of these experiences unfold in this place of dream logic. That's sort of my go-to definition of high strangeness is sort of, when dream logic bleeds into these sort of experiences. And to that extent, I'm not always sure how literally we can take a lot of these things, other than to say that there is something objectively there and objectively going on. So I'm a big fan of Carl Jung's concepts of the collective unconscious, and we have something about we could probably make some connections about the wild man being visiting us from some undiscovered country, which is essentially what a faraway planet is. But I think that if you look at these topics through that sort of transpersonal lens, saying that yes, people do have these experiences and there is some sort of intelligence, even if it comes from us, there's some sort of there's a there, right? You can do that, and you can also look at this stuff through these symbolic lenses that I really find refreshing and valuable. I mean, for example, as long as we're talking about Bigfoot and UFOs, there's a certain amount of interesting contrast that you can put between those two polarities. I mean, it seems like we're in the middle of those two things, right? Like UFOs and Bigfoot are opposite ends of a spectrum that we're sitting in the middle of. Bigfoot could very well be us from the past, and UFO occupants look like us in the future. Bigfoot's tall, the aliens are short. Bigfoot is all about, you know, eating and, oftentimes we're listening for their mouth noises and the aliens don't speak at all, right? They use telepathy. The sky is the future, the underworld is the past. Bigfoot lives in caves and aliens live in the sky. There's a lot of these different things you can sort of extrapolate as sort of looking at these us sitting in the middle of the spectrum between these two polarities that might well be ourselves in some sense. And I think that's always interesting and only gets highlighted further when you throw Bigfoot into the UFO mix.
I think that's very true. And I think that the UFO phenomena even is it's so far beyond what most people want to think about. They do think about it more today. I remember I was invited to speak at a senior citizens group back in the 80s or 90s on UFOs. And I'm thinking, I don't know how well received this talk will be. But as I arrived, it was a senior citizens center, so they had lots of other activities that one could do. We had lunch, and then I started speaking, and one by one, everyone just got up and left. But the conversation was mostly around they simply, black and white, did not believe that UFOs existed. So it was a
Yeah,
generational thing in some ways that they were not they simply did not have this in their reality and was not going to have this in their
it
reality.
was a protection mechanism, probably.
Yeah, and by and large, I think people do that with they do it with Bigfoot, they do it with UFOs, and they certainly do it with ghosts as well. It's anything that is outside of that safety zone, that reality that is very much in place. It's the box again. Anything outside of that, they can't entertain because once you start entertaining that, the walls start to crumble.
It seems like a depressing place to be for me. I can't imagine being in that space, but you know,
Well, that's me.
to each their
I
own, right?
also
Yeah,
I like the adventure. I like the mystery. I like the
yeah.
pursuit of any kind of information or new thought around it just to explore. But there is a divide in people that can handle that and those people who cannot.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm sure that you having been involved longer in this space than I have noticed this too. But like the temperature in the room has really changed in the last like 8 years or so. I mean, I was hypercritical of the New York Times disclosure. I've been hypercritical of the disclosure movement. I've thawed significantly since then because this has been such a productive disclosure season. But like the sort of people that I'm having conversations with about these topics, is really confronting. And the sort of interpretations that they're open to is even more shocking. I mean, the fact that people are talking about interdimensional hypotheses and holographic universes, um, people on the street are talking about those as solutions to the UFO mystery. Not only did did they not even want to talk about the UFO mystery 15 years ago, they're like up to speed with like a John Keel version of it. It just boggles my mind whenever that I run into that, and I run into it pretty darn frequently nowadays.
Don't you think a lot of that has to do with the internet, YouTube? I mean, all the massive amounts of information that's out there now. We
I
can be
think it's,
introduced to
yeah.
so many more things than we used to.
I think it's a confluence of factors. I think that, credit where credit's due, whatever this current disclosure season is, because it does come in seasons, um, has made some really good gains. I think it is exactly what you said, amount of access that we have at our fingertips. I also can't help but wonder if there aren't, again, greater games at play. Um, we are in this sort of post-truth era of the past 10-ish years. Not only in terms of like what institutions we put faith in and whether or not we believe authorities, but also the AI revolution. Like everything is topsy-turvy and there doesn't seem to be a consensus anymore. What I used to tell people at talks, and I'm still going to keep on telling them because it's still true. Imagine the person you didn't vote for in the last election as president, and they're telling you that UFOs are real. Do you believe them? And the answer is no. Like I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, it's a 50-50 split every time. So I don't think there's ever going to be a consensus that comes from authority structures on the UFO question in particular or any of this stuff in general. And that to me is that place where things like trickster phenomena thrive. So I suspect that if we do have like some sort of meta position intelligence like a trickster archetype or whatever forces are at play, that this is precisely when we would expect them to come out and show themselves a little bit more because there's this veneer of plausible deniability. Like they can always say, "No, just kidding. We weren't really there. I know it was really convincing." And I think that trickles down not only from the phenomenon itself, but again through our institutions and into our daily life.
What do you think about the idea that Bigfoot is more of like the fairy realm, that they're real, but they protect the woods, but they come out of nature, but then they go back and it's like an unusual thought.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hyper sympathetic to that. A lot of my work is looking at the fairy folklore, and there's a significant portion of where the footprints in that's dedicated to comparing Bigfoot to fairy folklore. And it's interesting that we think of, oh, big, tall, and hairy. That how could that be a fairy? But you've got trolls and you've got ogres, and those are sort of fairy folk. The fairies were not necessarily exclusively small; they had a tendency to be, but they were shapeshifters and size shifters. You've got some types of fairies, like the original French version of goblins or the Scottish brownies, which are household spirits that look a lot like these Littlefoot entities that people sometimes see, small simian sort of creatures. But what is really interesting to me is the way that, regardless of whether or not there is a connection, we tend to offload the same behavior on whatever creature our culture deems the most believable. What I mean by that is that I'm sure you've run into this phenomenon. I see it out in like, big sky country is where it's reported the most, but like these accusations of Bigfoot braiding the manes of horses. Like they'll steal into a barn at night and braid horses' manes, or they'll steal into the pasture at night and braid your horse's manes. I've seen an illusion. I don't know how reputable this is, but I've seen an illusion of a Russian researcher who watched in Almasty, their version of Bigfoot, actually go into a stable and watched as this Bigfoot analog, this Bigfoot-like creature, braided a horse's mane. What's interesting to me about that, whether or not this is a legitimate phenomenon, right, is that if you were to travel to 19th century Dartmoor or Dorset or, parts of Western England, that exact same phenomenon would have been blamed on fairies or witches. The idea that you go out to the stable in the morning and your horse's mane is tied in braids or tied in knots. Oh well, that's the good folk. They're making stirrups to ride your horse at night. Sometimes, in the case of witches, these were called witches' knots. Now, look, I don't know what to make of these braids, right? I've seen some interesting pictures. I think that some of them very well might just be people who are not combing their horses' manes at night, and they're sort of waking up in the next morning and be like, "Oh, it's so tangled, it must have been done by something." Regardless, that is something that a lot of us have viewed as an anomaly culturally, and we say, "Oh, what's the thing we could blame it on that our culture finds the most palatable?" In our case nowadays, it's Bigfoot, but it used to be fairies, and you can sort of find similarities like that on down the line if you do a sort of a comparison between Bigfoot stories, Bigfoot encounters, Bigfoot belief, and traditional fairy folklore. You can totally do that. So, um, I think that I'm very sympathetic to the idea that these are somehow tied to the forest or they're protectors of the forest. I mean, I have heard time and again from people who are both, on the woo side and on the flesh and blood side that these things can look like trees. They can stay really still and lay down and look like a log, or they can just sort of freeze in place and their hair's so matted they look like a ghillie suit, and they can end up looking like a stump. And so that sort of sounds kind of like a tree elemental, doesn't it? Speaking of ghillie suits, you've heard that comparison of Bigfoot looking like a person in a ghillie suit. The ghillie suit gets its name from the ghillie doo, which was a type of Scottish fairy that was said to sort of look like, a mass of, of vegetation. Um, so, there's plenty of like, comparisons that could be made. So again, I'm extremely sympathetic to that as well.
What about orbs? Some people say that they've seen a Bigfoot turn into an orb and an orb turn into a Bigfoot. Orbs seem to be also one of the phenomena that, like you said, lights that goes across the board of all phenomena, whether it be UFOs, aliens, ghosts, Bigfoot, I mean, everything.
Yeah, orbs have gotten a bad rap because, like, there are tons of photos that you get from ghost hunters that are like, look, I caught an orb on camera. And it's like, well, that's a bug, or that's, a dust mote or something. That's a it's frustrating. It's another one of those things where there's a bunch of different answers for that sort of phenomenon, right? So sometimes, yes, when they're caught on film or on video or whatever, they are dust or insects, right? But like there are orbs that are caught on film and video pictures and video that are genuinely strange, and there are people who see these with their naked eyes, and I'm quite enamored with the idea of orbs in the sense of like anomalous lights or ghost lights or spook lights, and yeah, it's the sort of thing, Linda, where I think that there's got to be some sort of connection there because you could sort of do a Venn diagram of UFO activity and Bigfoot sightings and ghost lights and alien big cats, those panthers, those black panthers that are supposedly roaming the U.S. And a lot of times they'll all converge over the same spots. I know that, for example, in the Big Thicket area of Texas, you've got a very famous ghost light there, and there have been stories of an orb turning into a Bigfoot that then morphs into a big cat. So I think that it's all something that is indeed related. There are a handful of stories of Bigfoot carrying orbs of light. Um, my friend Timothy Renner has done a lot of work, and he actually ended up writing the Bigfoot and Ghost Lights chapter of Where the Footprints End. And I think that there is some sort of connection, and it's interesting to me because there's the public facing version of there's a public facing persona of a lot of figures in ufology and cryptozoology. And I always say that, if you can get the nuts and bolts ufologist who says that these are aliens from another planet, if you can get them to the bar after their lecture and get a beer or two in them, they'll start to say, well, I do think these are extraterrestrials, but, I had these weird synchronicities happen when I was investigating this or that, or like, but there was that one time when I felt complete, ego dissolution in the presence of this craft, whatever. Similarly, I think that if you get a lot of cryptozoologists to the bar and you get a beer or two in them, you will inevitably get some story that is something to the effect of, well, yeah, there's this one place that we always go out to where we see a lot of Bigfoot activity, but there wasn't any Bigfoot that night, but there were these weird lights that were going through the forest. You hear illusions like that. I have friends who make it out to their research locations between 12 and 24 times a year. I mean, that's a pretty busy research schedule, I think. And they will say things like, I started out thinking that this was a big monkey, but then I saw the orbs. And then I had, things vanish suddenly from my camp and then return like the day before I left, or a lantern that I had in the tent with me showed up on top of the cab of the truck or whatever. They'll say things like that, and they're like, I'm not so sure anymore. And so I think that the lights are definitely one of those things that you can toss onto the heap that sort of indicate the possibility that we're dealing with something stranger.
Absolutely. Out of the 470 some interviews I've done on the Bigfoot subject, oftentimes, and I learned early on, that if you don't ask the question of anything unusual, whether it be orbs,
Mm.
UFOs, or any kind of paranormal activity, if you don't ask the question, you may not get that part of the story. But if I would ask that question, 9 times out of 10, they have experienced something that is a little unusual.
Right, and I think it's partially because our culture has siloed these things apart from each other. It's like, well, this doesn't have ghosts don't have anything to do with Bigfoot, and they certainly don't have anything to do with fairies. And like, why are you bringing up UFOs? But once you look at this holistically, it sort of does start to inform each other. I would like to ask you something, Linda. The sense that I arrived at with Tim is that the the sort of stories that you get that have high strangeness involved, right? And take that definition as you will, um, tend to be the more longitudinal habituator type experiences versus the fleeting like roadside crossings or a hunter seeing something in the woods. Do you think that is a sort of a rule of thumb that holds true that the more contact that people have either at a research area or on their property, the more likely they are to have these other anomalies that creep in that aren't just pointing towards a traditional cryptozoological answer? Is that your sense?
It does seem to have something to do with the consistency of the experience itself might have more opportunity for those oddities to occur. I don't
Hmm.
interview very many people that have only had a road crossing sighting. I tend to interview people that have either had, I've written a book about the subject matter, done some kind of research about it, have a little bit more to say about the Bigfoot subject matter.
Hmm.
But I did do a film called, and I called it Bigfoot the Limits, and it was on a property not far from where I live. These people had all kinds of phenomena going on, and luckily they documented it extremely well. They had the footprints in the sand, Bigfoot footprints in the sand, not in sand, in snow, and they were like 5 feet apart. I mean, that was just, and they had that happen twice. They caught
Huge,
this
yeah.
other little guy that was definitely not a Bigfoot on camera on a trail cam in their backyard, and it was peeking around the corner. But they just did such great documentation, but they had all these unusual sounds that they'd recorded as well, just some really strange things. So that was like by location because they had not had anything like that happen to them prior to moving to this location.
Hmm.
And it immediately started with the sounds, and it was a country setting, and it was a deep hollow behind their house that went down to a river and deep, very, very deep foliage. They never really saw a Bigfoot. What they saw was a whole lot of evidence of
Hmm.
something out there.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And so, yeah, I kind of wonder, and I don't know how far we should take this concept, but I like to play with it as a thought experiment. Like, if you look at something like the observer effect and indeterminacy and how it's a particle in a wave until you look at it. Um, like, is that sort of what we're sort of being encouraged to do when you get these sort of locations where it's like, oh, this could be a lot of different things, but it's just weird. Maybe whatever the phenomenon is preferring to remain in that state of indeterminacy. Like, don't call me a fairy, don't call me a alien visitation, don't call me a Bigfoot. I don't know. I wonder sometimes.
Yeah, I don't know. But with the people that I do talk to, oftentimes they have some kind of a strange encounter. They may see orbs with it, they may not. They may just have some unexplained thing. It was there, it disappeared very quickly. I know I did an interview yesterday with a person who was very trained militarily to, keep eyes on something, a target,
Hmm.
and they saw he was certain he saw a Bigfoot, and someone was with him, and then where he should have been able to trail that movement back into the wooded area, suddenly it was gone and there was no Bigfoot moving back into the wooded area. So he said, that was unexplainable to him. He couldn't say that Bigfoot disappeared, but he also couldn't explain how he couldn't keep eyes on him until he got out of sight.
Yeah, it's so refreshing to hear people because I think that's where a lot of like my sort of ethos comes from is just not telling I'm not telling experiencers they didn't see what they think they saw. Um and so I think my duty is to listen to things like that, like, oh, well, I should have been able to track it, but then it just stopped. And not say, like, oh, you were mistaken or this or that or the other. To just sit with it and be like, well, if this is true, what model do we have to adopt that could explain that? And part of my problem with like a lot of the people who rule this stuff out outright is somebody would hear that and they might say, "Oh, well, it just must have, dove for cover or it ducked into a ditch." And if you walk that logic back far enough, if you say, "Oh, it just ducked into cover," if you sort of have that mindset and you keep on walking it back, you wind up at, "Oh, my poor friend, you saw a bear," you know, and that's sort of where that line of reasoning leads you. So I think personally, I think it's a lot more intellectually honest and healthier to be like, "Okay, well, this is what the person said. Let's look at this as a phenomenologist and say, okay, this is the experience that they had. If this is true, then what do we have to entertain to accommodate it?"
Exactly. So
Yeah.
one of your books, Ecology of the Soul, talks about mythology and death. Can you give me some of the highlights of that book?
Yeah, it's a big one. It's it's about 260,000 words, so I'll try to distill into the elevator pitch. But yeah, I was wanting to write a book that explored the connections between UFOs and death. It was a lot more involved than I thought it would be. But long story short, people have there's no shortage of people who have UFO experiences that also involve the dead. Sometimes people will see dead loved ones aboard the craft. Sometimes they'll have a period of heavy UFO activity and they'll have something in their house, like the poltergeist phenomena that I mentioned. Sometimes includes, full-bodied apparitions of people, dead relatives and dead friends and family. Um, so I wanted to explore that, but what became very much apparent was that a lot of different things for me were pointing in this direction. The first of which is that the UFO experience looks a lot like the near-death experience, right? Kenneth Ring talked about this extensively in the 1990s. The UFO experience also looks a lot like shamanic initiations across various cultures. Eddie Bullard and Simon Harvey Wilson talked about this around the same time. And shamanic initiations often involve near-death experiences to push you past that threshold and bring you back with sort of knowledge and abilities like the poltergeist and psi phenomena that we see from near-death experiences and UFO occupants. So like all these things are starting to really play well together, right? And it all seems to suggest that there's a space that you go to and come back from changed, according to your cosmology, better, with knowledge and talents and psychic talents. And so you've got that sort of weird little constellation of circular logic. Well, NDEs look like UFO experiences, which look like shamanic initiations, which involve NDEs, and you can go around and around and around in that circle, right? But you also have the sort of transitive property going on with the fairy stuff. By which I mean, 1969, Dr. Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia makes a very compelling case that whatever is behind the UFO phenomenon is behind what has been a lot of spirit phenomenon and what is behind has been behind Western European fairy phenomena. I have a whole list of about 25 different points that we could go through. I won't belabor them right now, but a lot of these older fairy stories look like UFO stories, and a lot of these UFO stories look like older fairy stories and little people stories worldwide, mostly Western Europe, but like really a lot of the stories you can find from across the world they talk about fairies because that's a universal thing, look like the UFO question. But a lot of different cultures, not just in Europe, but around the world, conflated and associated fairies with the human dead. There's an argument to be made that a lot of people before the introduction of something like theosophy, where you started talking about fairies as nature elementals or something like that. Before that, there was a lot of assumptions that the fairies were the dead, or the fairies would take you to death, or just look through some works like Walter Evans Wentz's Fairy Faith in the Celtic Countries. The number of times people would like go to a fairy party and see a dead neighbor with them, like it's stories like that. So if the fairies look like the dead and the UFO occupants look like fairies, then are we dealing with just, dead people, or whatever we become when we make that transition? So it became very apparent that my tidy little book looking at UFOs and death was going to be a lot bigger project than I initially intended. And so putting all those things into dialogue, trips to fairyland, shamanic initiations, near-death experiences, UFO encounters, out-of-body experiences, altered states of consciousness, obviously, of which near-death experiences are one. Um, Ended up just being this giant, this giant book, and I ended up finding some interesting cryptid connections as well. Not the least of which is, I think it's still worth entertaining the idea that something very Bigfoot-like once roamed our planet. seems to be that way from the fossil record. What if we're just dealing with the ghosts of whatever that is? You know, you'd mentioned remote viewing. There's a story that the late Jim Mars used to tell about talking to remote viewers who were tasked with viewing Loch Ness, and they concluded that yes, there was something in Loch Ness, but it had the ability to wink in and out of existence, and they sort of suggested that perhaps the Loch Ness monster was the ghost of a plesiosaur. So if we've got dinosaur ghosts, why not have, you know, Australopithecus ghost or Gigantopithecus ghost or Paranthropus ghost or something like that? So, it was kind of the gift that keeps on giving. It ended up being a really parsimonious way to look at the phenomenon holistically. I'm not sure. It works enough. It works well enough for me that I could sort of be like, okay, well, that's an explanation of the phenomenon that I can that works well and that I can have in my in my back pocket. Although I'm still dedicated to exploring other solutions to what's going on because I don't want to get rid of that mystery. You know, like we talked about earlier, I hate the idea of getting rid of the mysteries and flattening everything out. It sounds so boring.
Yeah, if we find a Bigfoot, it's all over. Our mystery is done.
Yeah.
And then there's nothing else to research. There's no more phenomena. And there is a major disappointment with that at times, even though I know a lot of people out there looking for a body that might, give us some evidence.
It's the dog who catches the car, right?
Yeah, but then the mystery's gone. And then what do
Yeah.
you have to do? It's like, well, I'm gonna have to move on to another subject.
Yeah, pretty
Yeah,
much.
I totally get that. Well, thank you so much. Now, if someone wanted to buy, how many books do you have? And if someone wanted to buy those, where do they find them?
Well, it's kind of weird because, Foot Where the Footprints End was conceived as one book, but it was split into two for logistical reasons. Similarly, Ecology of Souls is three, just for, because it would have been gigantic. And like there's a third book that's just like the end notes in the bibliography because it was so big. So 10-ish, 11-ish, I'm not sure, books. But you can find everything that you need to know about me, and more probably, at joshuacutchin.com. That's JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. There's an email link there or a message form for you to fill out, or you can email me directly. I do have books on hand that I sign and sell and send anywhere in the U.S. With no upcharge for my autograph or anything, just the same price. And I don't do international because I've had some problems with international post. But if you're in the US, like getting you an autographed book is not a problem at all. So joshuacutchin.com.
Well, much research and much, I'm sure, effort into all of that work. 10 books, 11 books, that's a lot.
Well, it's been the gift that keeps on giving. It's been really I guess this if I have a moment to sort of talk about like what this journey has meant for me. There's this great quote by the French ufologist Ami Michel, and he said something to the effect of, looking at ufology is not so much a scientific endeavor as it is an active initiation. He says, you start looking at reports of things in the sky, and you end up reading about Arab mystics, and like that's very much been my experience is the journey of becoming interested in things that I never would have been interested in using these topics as a gateway. And I think that it's if approached the right way, this can be an incredibly rewarding pursuit in one's life.
Absolutely. It certainly has been mine, confusing at times as well. Um, Definitely will stump you at times because you think you've got it all clear, and then it's like something just blows that out of the water and you're right back where you started. But
Absolutely, absolutely,
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Joshua. I really appreciate you joining me today, and I hope I can have you back sometime.
absolutely. Be happy to. Thanks so much, Linda. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience, certainly, for watching the show. Be sure to subscribe, and we shall see you next time.